Some of you will remember Phil Everson, who came to talk to us earlier this year for the Heritage Festival, talking about the history of rowing in Putney, if you remember that. I think we had a much smaller audience then, so I'm sure he's relieved to see some more faces here tonight. He knows all sorts of things about the borough. He's been very helpful helping me, which has nothing to do with this whatsoever, about a gravestone in Mount Nod, and he's sorted that out for me. So he knows all sorts of things about the borough. But tonight he's going to talk about Wandsworth pubs, sort of past and present. So over to you, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Yes, hi. As Jenny said, my name's Phil Everson. Some of you have seen me before. I'm a sort of interloper, really, from Putney, the wild lands beyond the border called Putney. But I've decamped into Wandsworth for this occasion. Actually, I hate the Wandsworth Society. I really hate the Wandsworth Society because they force me to visit every single pub in Wandsworth for this talk. And, you know, it's hard, it's tough work, but, you know, somebody's got to do it. Actually, that's not entirely true. I already knew some of the... I should say, by the way, I gave a talk a couple of months ago on the pubs of Putney, so this is a kind of extension of that. And I know the pubs of Putney quite well, whereas I know the pubs of Wandsworth only slightly, and I hope you'll bear with me. So I have been at a bit of a disadvantage. I've had to do some field research, of course, but it's also, so that was a slight drawback as far as I'm concerned. And also, it's kind of hard at the moment keeping track of, frankly, what is open and what is not open, because pubs, the rate of closure of pubs seems, I get the impression that they are closing at an even faster rate at the moment, which is quite depressing. So my talk may not be entirely up to date, and if any of you knows better, please shout out, because, you know, I cannot guarantee that my information is entirely up to date. Anyway, here we go. I have been heavily dependent for this talk on what is kind of my Bible, from a local historian I greatly respect, called Dorian Gerholt, who's written a history of Wandsworth pubs, published in 2012 by the Wandsworth Historical Society, and also followed up the following year by the pubs of Putney and Roehampton. But I've had Dorian's full approval to quote verbatim, in some cases, from that work, which I thoroughly recommend. I've got a copy here, but it's still available, I think, and is well worthwhile, as is its fellow companion booklet, The Pubs of Putney and Roehampton. So I'm very grateful to Dorian for that. I started off the Putney talk with talking about the breweries and brewing in Putney, and I thought I'd start off the Wandsworth talk in the same way. And I looked for breweries in Wandsworth. There were 5 in Putney over the years, you know, from about the 13th century onwards. I struggled to find breweries in Wandsworth other than Young's, or what became Young's, and I could not find one. If anybody knows better, please tell me, but I could not find any breweries in Wandsworth other than what became Young's. It was obviously a brewery before Young's took it over, but I couldn't find one. So around 1533, an inn was recorded on Ram Street. It wasn't called the Ram Inn at the time, but a hostelry, a tavern, was recorded on Ram Street in the early 16th century. Brewing was recorded, first recorded on the site in 1576. And in 1581, there was a record of Humphrey Langridge brewing at the sign of the Ram. And then that brewery passed by marriage to the Draper brothers, Somerset and his brother Humphrey, who sold the brewery to a Kentish brewer called Thomas Tritton in 1763. In 1803, the Surrey Iron Railway opened from near the brewery, somewhere near Ram Street, to Croydon, and that's significant for two reasons. One, the Surrey Iron Railway may well have had their meetings in the Spread Eagle pub, which was one of the most important pubs in Wandsworth, and also because the shareholders included Charles Florence Young. The Young family seem to have gone in for kind of curious forenames, curious middle names. Shortly after the Ram Brewery closed, I wanted to find out, or to make sure, to find out what was going to happen to the Young's archive, and I visited one of the Young's family in their office, which was somewhere down near Point Pleasant, as far as I remember, and he was called Torquil Sligo Young, which is a good name. Anyway, one of the shareholders included Charles Florence Young, and in 1831, his son, or one of his sons, Charles Allen Young, together with Anthony Bainbridge, bought the brewery from the Trittons, which included 80 pubs. So that was really the start of the Young's operation in Wandsworth. The following year, strangely enough, 1832, fire destroyed most of the brew house, although it was quickly rebuilt. And 50 years later, in 1883, a fire again extensively damaged part of the brewery and the Ram Inn, both of which were rebuilt. Then, in 1883, the Young and Bainbridge partnership was dissolved, and the business henceforth became Young and Co. New brewhouse built a century later, 1984. And then, of course, in 2006, Young's announced the closure of the Ram Brewery and that they would start a joint venture with Charles Wells in Bedford. Although they have maintained they're not even a microbrewery, they call it a nano brewery on the site in the old Quality Labs, I think, on the Ram site, just to maintain the tradition of brewing on the Ram site in Wandsworth. And then in 2011, just over 10 years ago, Charles Wells bought out Young's share. So effectively, the Youngs had no stake or financial stake then in the Eagle Brewery in Bedford. And in 2017, Wells themselves announced the sale of the brewery and wine business to Marston's, including the Bombardier and McEwan brands, and also the rights to the Young's brands. So that whole sort of thing has really changed now. But brewing continues on the old Ram site. And in 2020, Sambrooks, who are based in Battersea, took a 25-year lease on the old Ram Brewery site, where they have been brewing since March last year. And their tap, their adjacent pub, opened in July last year. So brewing does continue in Wandsworth, but I could not find any brewery in Wandsworth other than the Young's Brewery. It's just some of an old photograph there of the brewery. And of course the wonderful Shire horses that used to deliver in the local area. I used to work in an office in Brewhouse, appropriately in Brewhouse Street, which was the location of Putney's first ever brewery. The brewery that, in fact, Walter Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell's father, once ran. That photograph actually was taken at an event in Brewhouse Street, Brewhouse Lane as it became. And my office overlooked the car park of what was then the Castle pub in Putney, and about once or twice a week I used to hear the clip-clop of the dray horses delivering to the castle. Now then, this is the total. How many pubs have there been in total over the years since the 16th century in Wandsworth? Any of us? How many in total? Including every kind, beer shops, taverns, inns, pubs, you name it. How many in total? Did somebody say 200? 100?
But are you including the expanded borough, since Wandsworth took on Battersea?
Good question.
Talking about
Yeah, I'm talking about Wandsworth Parish, really, yeah. I make it 108. But obviously, some of those were very short-lived and some, unknown location. But I could find 108 anyway. How many are there now? In Wandsworth? 20? Did you say I had 20? Yeah, not far off. I make it 28. Of which half, or actually probably, this is where I need your input, because half were Young's pubs, but Young's are also divesting themselves of their Tide outlets, and so there are probably 12 or even fewer Young's pubs in that 28, but I do believe that figure of 28 is correct. I did check a couple on the way here tonight. So these are they. The ones underlined are Young's pubs and are still Young's pubs as far as I know. The ones in italics, which there is the Grapes, are former Young's pubs. So for example, the Grapes, a former Young's pub a couple of years ago, was bought out by an organisation called Punch Taverns. And you'll see, but all those other pubs, I think, are still open. I hope are still open. And there's some more Young's pubs, plus the two in italics there, the Old Sergeant and the Pig and Whistle, are, I believe, anyway, now part of the Grumpy Pub Company group. There's a group called the Grumpy Pub Company. So, the Young's connection with Wandsworth is gradually declining. Sorry? Oh, the Tir na Nog. Yeah, the Tir na Nog, sorry, has been an Irish pub since 1999. But it was the site of the previous Horse and Groom. It was previously the Horse and Groom, but yeah, the Tir na Nog is an Irish-style pub on Garrett Lane, which, been Irish since 1999.
If Young's has been now absorbed in Marston's, can any pub be called a Young's pub anymore?
Well, that's a very good question, to which I don't know the answer. I'm honestly not sure exactly what the legal relationship is now between Young's and Wells and Marston's. But there are still...
I think the pubs are separated off from the brewery.
Yeah.
Charles Wells, the Young's maintained control of the pubs.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right, because certainly those pubs still trade under the Young's banner, so to speak, at least the underlined ones, unless, as I say, you know better. So yeah, you're absolutely right that the pubs are divorced from the brewery, from the brewing. Right? Yeah. I have excluded some bars, even though GJ's bar in Garrett Lane was formerly a pub. Incidentally, Wagon is correctly spelt, 2 G's. So this is a very rough graph I've tried to do of the growth and decline of Wandsworth pubs over the years 1622 to 2022. And you will see that there is a quite nice curve peaking in in 1922, probably the 20th century. Generally was quite a good period for pubs, and down to now 28. I've superimposed there on, for comparison, the Putney pubs, which are in the sort of maroony, I'm colourblind, but anyway, that dark red colour. And you can see that while Putney has fewer pubs, had and still has fewer pubs, the trend is pretty much the same. I find it very difficult, nigh on impossible, to try and find figures, historic figures for London pubs, and that's the best I could do, I'm afraid, 2001, 2017, but you can see the trend is sadly downwards, and I suspect that if you extrapolated beyond 2017, you would find that curve dropping down quite steeply. That certainly is my impression from looking at Wandsworth pubs. Now, which is Wandsworth's oldest pub? That no? I reckon it's the oldest recorded anyway is probably the Ram, which is temporarily closed, but certainly, as I said earlier, recorded since at least as the Ram from at least 1581 and as a pub probably earlier. Although the current building, obviously, which is more recent, is Grade 2 listed and dates from 1883. Although the Ram is currently closed.
It's been sold.
Has it been sold?
Youngs have sold it to Brian.
Have they? It says, I'll touch on it later, but it's the website, or one of the websites, says temporarily closed, and peering through the window, the tables and chairs are all there, so I suspect it will reopen.
I think it has opened under a new owner.
Okay, it wasn't open last week, but it may well have reopened. As I say, it said temporarily closed, and it looked as if it was likely to reopen. In which case, it would actually be when it does reopen, it will be the oldest operating pub. Meanwhile, I reckon it's probably the Ship, recorded as far back as 1662, where there's a record of gunpowder being delivered at Ye Ship at Wandsor, which is one of the old spellings of Wandsworth. Licensing records in 1721. So, surviving pubs. Now, here I will need my reference. I think I might sit down at this point. If you bear with me. I'm getting old. Right, surviving pubs. I tried, incidentally, I thought, how do I deal with the surviving pubs? Do I deal with it on terms of age, the oldest to the youngest, or the youngest to the oldest? And I decided to try and do it geographically, going west to east. And that sort of fell apart, really. But anyway, so bear with me. We do dart about a bit all over the place geographically. But I started with what is probably the furthest west, which is the good old Cat's Back in Point Pleasant off Putney Bridge Road. Cat's Back, first recorded in 1855, and for many years, for most of its life actually, was known as the Foresters or the Foresters Arms, 1867 to 1980. And the Brush Arms, it was known as the Brush Arms in 1987. And then subsequently the Cat's Back, there's various stories about the name the Cat's Back. The one I heard was that a couple were managing the pub whilst the landlord and landlady were on holiday. The pub's cat went astray, got lost, and they telexed or faxed or whatever the landlord and landlady to say the cat was lost, and then the cat returned. And they telexed or faxed or texted or whatever. The landlord said, the cat's back. And that's how it was, or how the name came about. I remember the Cat's Back when it was full of like sofas and easy chairs and, you know, an odd mishmash of furniture. It's smartened up a bit since, but it's still a nice little friendly pub. A nice friendly barman. Going further west, Point Pleasant, obviously, as you probably know, is across the other side of the road, sort of down here. That's the Queen Adelaide, further along Putney Bridge Road. That photograph, I would guess, is taken around early part of the century sometime. Trams were replaced on Putney Bridge Road by trolley buses at the start of the war, I think about 1939. But the Adelaide was actually first recorded as the King's Head from briefly in 1704 to 1706, then the Queen's Head from 1719 to 1829, so for quite a few years, and then renamed the Queen Adelaide by 1832 in honour of William IV's Queen. Leased by Youngs in 1838 and bought by them outright as recently as 1915. The present building is reckoned as being late Victorian, late 19th century. That shot of the interior is not as I remember the interior. I remember the interior as being carpeted, so I suspect that's the flagstone interior that's probably an old shot. And the hot pole, again a bit further along Putney Bridge Road. Licensed in 1867, I can't tell you much more about it. It's a Shepherd Neame house. That's about as much as I can tell you. I've included there a photograph, which is interesting, of the Jolly Gardeners, which we'll touch on later. There's a credible similarity in the style of the two pubs, especially the little balustraded roof and the little conical section in the middle. They were both from about 1867, and I can't help but feel they had the same architect, but unfortunately, my architect contact, Andrew Catto from the Putney Society, is on holiday at the moment, and so he hasn't been able to help me, but I'm sure those were designed by the same person. And there's the interior of the hot pole, which I visited a few times. Again, nice, friendly local pub. Sorry? Oh, yeah. This is one that I visited recently because I got a bit confused between the Grand Union and the King's Arms, but then I discovered that the Grand Union and the King's Arms are one and the same thing. The King's Arms in the High Street, recorded as, it's one of those pubs that's changed its name quite a bit, recorded as the King's Arms, 1721 to 63, Queen's Arms from 1786 to 93, King's Arms again until 2011, and then the Grand Union until about 2017, when it reverted to the King's Arms. Bought by Young and Bainbridge from Earl Spencer in 1836, and like the Spread Eagle, which we'll come on to later, one of the first Young's houses to be bought outright. It was expanded and remodeled in the 1930s, and has been Young's since 1836 and is quite definitely still a Young's house. Now this is Wandsworth's most recent pub, the Brewery Tap, opened in July last year on the old Ram site. It's a bit kind of stark and clinical for my taste, although it's quite nice with the exposed pipes and what have you, but not my kind of place. Architect was Roger Mears, if that means anything. Does that mean anything? Roger Mears. Anyway, there you go. So, yeah, only been open just over a year. Now, the Old Grapes, that's more like a pub. Originally a beer shop, recorded back in 1833, was once named Camera Pub of the Year, and has been a Young's pub since 1841 until a couple of years ago. I went in there last week and spoke to the landlady, who was very friendly, and said that it was sold by or bought from Young's by Punch Taverns. That's another of these groups, Punch Taverns, a couple of years ago, but was very busy and pleasant and friendly when I called in last week at lunchtime. Now, the Spread Eagle. This goes back a long way. first recorded 1664, licensed in 1721, and one of Wandsworth's most important pubs or inns from 1790 onwards. For example, it had an assembly room used for important meetings. Earl Spencer's agents collected rents there in the 1820s. Vestry held parish referendums there in the 1840s. The county court sat there in the 1850s, and the Baptists held services there from 1859 to 1863, as did the Methodists and the Catholics at various times. So a very important pub. From 1864 to 1903, it was licensed as a music hall, although in 1890 the license was transferred to a replacement hall adjacent, which became the Court Cinema, which was one of the first bioscope cinemas in London, 1908 to 1931. And the Spread Eagle Tap had a separate license in the mid-19th century. That again has been young since 1836. An 1857 entry in the Young and Bainbridge property book reads, "These premises occupy a commanding position in the High Street with considerable frontage in Garrett Lane. They consist of a tavern and tea garden, a large ballroom, a portion of which is now used as the county court, a separate tap which has a license of its own, and a considerable range of stabling." So that's the Spread Eagle. That's more or less as it is today, although even that photograph, I think, is quite old. The Brewers, likewise, at the bottom of St Anne's, what's it called, St Anne's Road, St Anne's Hill, has been a Young's pub since the beginning, since 1831. Land originally leased from Magdalen College, Oxford, and Young's didn't actually buy the freehold until 1974. It was licensed as the Two Brewers since 1721. I thought it might have been named Two Brewers after Young and Bainbridge, but it was before the Young and Bainbridge days. Rebuilt in 1900, remodelled from 1937-38, and renamed the Brewers Inn where am I? I've lost my dates. Quite recently, anyway, 1994. I don't know why did they rename this? I mean, what's wrong with the Two Brewers? Everybody knew it as the Two Brewers.
It's got hotel rooms. Yeah. It's a hotel as well, so and then 16 well-appointed rooms.
I wish they wouldn't rename. I hate anyway. There's a pub in Putney that has just closed, actually, called the Lost Society, of all stupid names, which was its seventh name, its seventh iteration. Anyway, there you go. It's one of my little beefs. One of the older, well, not particularly old, but certainly one of the well-known pubs of Wandsworth on Old York Road, is the Alma. Was a beer shop back in the 19th century, 1863 onwards. Present building dates from 1866, and it's had a license since 1867. Been Young's since 1872. The name, of course, commemorates the battle during the Battle of the Alma during the Crimean War. The Alma being a river which flows into the Black Sea. Refurbished in 1987, although many of the original features, including the painted mirrors there, were retained and restored. Nice pub. I like the Alma. And the Ship, of course, by the bridge, with the exception of the Ram, the oldest operating pub in Wandsworth, I believe, anyway. As recorded back in 1662 and 1699, and in the licensing records since 1721, and has been a Young's pub since 1832. Present building was built by Young's sometime before 1857, and who also bought some cottages which lay between the pub and the river and demolished them to open up the view. That was taken, I suspect, 20, 30 years ago, something like that. Anyway, from one of the older to one of the newer pubs, the second newest, if you like, in Wandsworth, another Young's pub, the Waterfront, opened in 2006, I think.
Where is that? On the waterfront.
Yeah, it's just east of the bridge. You'll see a photograph a bit later on what Dorian describes as the old distillery site. I'm not quite sure what distillery that was. Does anybody know? Which one? Oh, right. Okay. Gin. Then, yeah. Okay. I haven't visited it, but it looks quite nice inside and has a nice terrace. And there's the bridge. The Old Sergeant, which on Garrett Lane, still open as far as I'm aware. Yeah. Recorded back in the 1720s as the Sergeant, and from 1749 onwards as the Old Sergeant. Been a Young's pub again since the early days, 1836. Although, as I say, I believe it now is part of the Grumpy Pub Company. There's that photograph taken around 1920. Yeah, that's the same photograph. That's it, as more or less, I believe, as it is today. And yeah, the Tir na Nog, somebody mentioned, on the site was previously the Horse and Groom, which was a beer shop back in the 1830s. The present building dates from 1904 and has been an Irish pub called the Tir na Nog since 1999. Land of the Young, apparently it means. So, not a pub for me. Grosvenor Arms, further down or further up Garrett Lane. I can't tell you very much about, actually, other than that it's been licensed since 1868. Otherwise, typical local pub, I guess. Here's the Jolly Gardeners, again on Garrett Lane. I love that photograph, taken, I would guess, around the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. Looks to me about, so I don't know, 1910s, something like that. Jolly Gardeners, originally a beer shop, been a pub since 1867. And that's all I can tell you about the Jolly Gardeners, other than its similarity to the Hot Pole. And if I find out, I'll let the Wandsworth Society know.
Looks very like the Queen Adelaide, doesn't it? The front of it.
What, the Horse and Groom, that one, the Jolly Gardeners?
Yes.
It's very like it's almost a carbon copy of the Hot Pole, but yeah, odd. There's the Wandle, still on Garrett Lane. What is now called the Wandle. It was originally called the Sailor Prince from 1870 to 2000, and then it was taken over by the Puzzle chain of pubs, which was a curious name. There used to be, I think, the Greyhound on Fulham Palace Road was also a Puzzle pub. And it was a Puzzle, it changed to the Puzzle in 2000 and then to the Wandle in 2010. That present building was opened in 1887, actually, as the Sailor Prince Hotel, the prince in question being the Duke of York, future King George V, who was a keen sailor. So that's the Wandle. There's the interior. And the country house, which is just in Groton Road, just off Garrett Lane. Often known locally, apparently, according to Dorian, as the Fog. Possibly referring to the mist coming off the nearby Wandle or smoke from the railway. was briefly known as the Railway Tavern in 1990.
Is that a very recent photograph? Is that a very recent photograph?
That is a recent photograph, yeah.
It looks very stylish.
Yeah.
So who owns
The building itself is from... it's the early part of the 20th century, I think, the building. Maybe the 1920s, 1930s. There's an interior shot there. The fittings, the internal fittings from the 1930s have been retained, and Dorian describes it as a good example of a surviving backstreet pub. Yeah, I must do a pub crawl down Garrett Lane one day. And then further down Garrett Lane, that's the original halfway house at 433 Garrett Lane, which was opened in 1850 and until 1970, if I got my dates, I've lost my place. 1850, and was closed and demolished in 1976. And then after a gap of 15 years, the new and current halfway house was opened in 1991 by Young's, where it's just near Earlsfield Station, or one of the stations across the road. I've quizzed there a few times. There's the leather bottle in a painting from 1867. But the leather bottle dates back to 1721 originally, and is still there as far as I'm aware. Yeah, still there. And that is the original building. Yeah, the corner pin, Somerstown, which is, runs off Garrett Lane near the old stadium, the dog track and the old football stadium, I think. Began as the Duke of Wellington, 1853 to 1856 to 63, but has been known as a corner pin, or was known as a corner pin from 1867 to 1999, then briefly as the Riverside, 1999 to 2001, and then reverted to a corner pin. That building was built in 1924. And the East Hill, which is, in spite of the fact that it says free house there, there's an old photograph, has been, as I established on my way here tonight, has been a Young's pub since 2011. This is another one that's changed its name quite a lot. It was built around 1878, known as the East Hill Hotel, from 1884 to 1978. Then it was known as the Horseshoes, 79 to 82. Then the old East Hill from 1982 to 87. Then it was the Slug and Lettuce. Then it was 21 Alma Road. And then it became the East Hill again in 2001, which was the time, 2000, just 10 years before it was taken over by Young's. But again, a busy pub it was tonight. Actually, it doesn't look like that inside now. This pub, the Surrey Tavern, it's the best photograph I could find, and I can't tell you anything about it other than that it was licensed in 1865, and I can't tell you anything more about it.
It's a wine bar now.
The Surrey Tavern, yeah. Is it?
It's not a pub anymore. It's called Brinkley.
Okay. Yeah, you see, things change, and it's quite hard keeping track. County Arms is still going, I think. Licensed in 1852, and has been a Young's pub, was a Young's pub from the start, although it was rebuilt in 1900. There's some people in the garden at the side there, apparently from around 1910, possibly awaiting the start of a concert. They used to have outdoor concerts. There it is. That was taken 2009. Park Tavern, very pleasant pub, corner of Westhill Road and Merton Road, which was opened, if I get it right, licensed in 1853. Not much more to say about it, really. And again, the interior may not necessarily look like that anymore. The Earl Spencer, a bit further down Merton Road, one thinks obviously of the Spencer Arms, now the Spencer in Putney and the Earl Spencer in Roehampton, obviously all recalling the Spencer family, Lords of the Manor of Wimbledon, who owned much of the land in Wandsworth until the 19th century, and Young and Bainbridge both leased and bought land from the Spencers, including the fields, incidentally, that became part of the brewery site. Apparently it was briefly called the Earl of Spencer, rather bizarrely, from 2000 to 2008. I didn't catch that. Okay, but yeah, that building dates from 1931. Yeah, rebuilt in 1931. Yeah, the Gardener's Arms, also Merton Road, another Young's pub. Recorded from 1875, rebuilt in 1931, and has been known just simply as the Gardeners since 2010. That's a recent-ish photograph. Pig and Whistle, yeah, Pig and Whistle is interesting. Built quite recently, in 1900, probably as a pub, but couldn't get a license. And so it operated as two shops, 479 Merton Road as a hardware store, and 481 Merton Road as an off-license. They were both bought by Youngs in 1969, who continued to operate number 481 as an off-license until a full license was granted as recently as 1974. So as a pub, it's quite recent. And there's the inside. The Royal Standard, Ballantyne Road, at least the book here says Ballantyne Road. I couldn't find a Ballantyne Road. Ballantyne Street. Yeah, exactly. I could find Ballantyne Street, couldn't find Ballantyne Road. But there it is, known as the, it's just, yeah, near Old York Road. Recorded from 1865, briefly known as the Tonsley Tup from 2001 to 2005, but it's reverted to the Royal Standard, and that's the original building. That, as far as I know, are all the surviving pubs. Who was in charge of time? Jenny, are we okay for another 10 minutes or so? Yeah? Okay, so that's all the surviving pubs. So I have covered, I've continued to cover, and we can just stop whenever we like. We may get through them all, actually, on some of the closed and lost pubs. Here I've gone in terms of time, so starting with the most recently closed and going to the more long ago closed, so to speak. So the Ram, obviously, as we now have learned, dates back to the 16th century. Recorded as a pub. There was an inn, anyway, in Ram Street, which was previously Red Lion Street from the 16th century onwards. There it is in 1920 with the brewery next door. There again, probably one of those early 20th century, I suspect, 1920s-ish photograph, probably taken around the same time as the Queen Adelaide photograph. Briefly known as the Brewery Tap from 1974 onwards, and then reverted to the Ram Inn, and closed when the brewery closed in 2006, reopened a few years ago, and then recently closed, and as somebody said here, has been sold, and hopefully is due to reopen, being one of Wandsworth's more historic pubs. Yeah, this is another recent closure, the Crane on Armory Way. Licensed in, where am I? Recorded anyway from 1704 and licensed from 1721. The name Crane may be the bird. It may be the cranes used to unload boats on the Wandle, more likely the latter. That's a photograph from the Heritage Archive, taken around 1938, before Armory Way was actually completed here in the foreground. And there it was. There's a sign on the side there that says opening soon. I suspect that was at the end of its period as the Armory and when it was about to become the Crane again. And that's how it was until recently, where you see that in terms of the sign, they've gone for the bird rather than the mechanical crane. But that's been closed, I think, in the last year or two, hasn't it? I don't know. Shame, but it is a bit, as we were discussing earlier, a bit out of the way. The Rose and Crown, another recent casualty, one of Wandsworth's older pubs. Well, licensed in 1721, rebuilt in the 1930s. Became, apparently, I don't remember this, but it became Freeways and Nightclub, 1985 to 1987, and then Gleeson and Sons Corner House in 1998. And there was more recently an attempt to turn it into what was I think described as an upmarket sushi restaurant, I think. Anyway, curiously, bizarrely called L'Affaire, where you presumably went to have a little affair. But anyway, that's been closed, I think, in a couple of years now, sadly. I've included the Jenny Lind, which is on Inner Park Road, for a couple of reasons. It just creeps into, you'd think being on Inner Park Road it would be Wimbledon, but it just creeps in. It's just on the sort of western edge of Wandsworth. It's quite a recent pub, built in 1959. It was taken over by the landlady, the former landlady of the Northumberland Arms on Upper Richmond Road, who I knew quite well. I used to play pool there a bit. And it also, of course, is a reminder of Jenny Lind, the Swedish nightingale, so-called, who lived in Putney High Street, in Laurel House in Putney High Street from 1855 to 1858, with her husband, who was her former accompanist, called Otto Goldschmidt. And then she moved to Roehampton Lodge, and then they moved to Argyle Lodge on Wimbledon Parkside, which is why this was called the Jenny Lind. And then eventually bought some land on Victoria Drive, where they had a house built for them called Oakley, where she was bothered with sightseers. One of the sightseers was a lady who was at school in Putney for a couple of years called Dame Ethel Smythe. Anybody heard of a female composer called Ethel Smythe? She went to school in Putney. I can't find out where for a couple of years, but her autobiography says that she went to. She has this annoying habit of putting people's names as just initials. Anyway, she was very thrilled when on a school walk one day they walked down Victoria Drive and she found herself walking past the house of Jenny Lind, whom she claims later to have got to know when Jenny Lind was teaching in Leipzig during Ethel Smythe's Leipzig years, although Ethel Smythe claims to have had intimate relationships with a lot of people, and I have my doubts. Anyway, that's why I've included the Jenny Lind, although it closed quite a few years ago. And the Grid, again, another recent pub, as recent as 1994, was apparently the first pub, and is presumably now the last pub, to be built on the Southfields Grid. The only pub, and the Southfields Grid presumably doesn't have any pubs.
Yes, the old fields.
Does it?
The old fields, which was the garage, which was previously a garage.
Oh, right.
It's just next door.
Well, there you go. You see, I've talked rubbish. Hare and Hounds, another one in Somerstown, originally called the White Lion until 2006, and then renamed the Hare and Hounds. That building in the photograph there dates from 1904. And another casualty, sadly. That quite close to here, the Royal Oak, from dates from 1860 on the south side of East Hill, I suppose, rebuilt. At some point, I can't find out exactly when it was rebuilt, or that it closed in late 2010, although the building is still there. And those two signs on the side there actually say the Toby House. I'm not quite sure where that relates to the latter days of the Royal Oak. But the ground floor was supposedly converted to a flat in 2014, but it shows no signs of occupation at the moment anyway. Prince of Wales up Garrett Lane. A Tesco, yeah, exactly. Built in 1852, licensed in 1859, named after the future King Edward VII. Young's Pub since 1685, rebuilt in 1898, damaged by a bomb apparently in 1940, closed in 2010, and is apparently now a Tesco local or whatever it's called. Or is it Tesco Metro? Anyway, it's a Tesco. Star and Gutter, St Anne's Hill, another one damaged by a bomb in, sometime in probably 1940-41, rebuilt in the 50s, 60s, closed 2008, and converted to flats, of course, in around 2010. The Wheatsheaf, it still exists apparently, the building at the end of Putney Bridge Road. I haven't actually been past it. I keep meaning to go past it. But it was bought by Youngs, or licensed in 1853, bought by Youngs in 1916, and was never altered or expanded, remained a one-bar house. There was a bit of a campaign to stop the closure, but it nevertheless closed in 2008 and was apparently converted to residential use. Builders Arms in Longfield Street, which is off Merton Road, recorded from 1870, shortly after Longfield Street was built, so presumably built more or less contemporary with the street. And closed in 2001 and converted into houses. The Foresters, which I don't know or never did know at all, in Allfarthing Lane, closed in 1997. From dates from 1867, the building itself is apparently still there, so I'm told. Looks as if it might have been rather a nice place. Now the Champion stores, I'm intrigued by this, because Dorian's booklet and other references describe it as being at 76 Warple Way. Now, there isn't a Warple Way in Wandsworth, there isn't a Warple anything in Wandsworth, as far as I know. All the Warples are in Wimbledon, the Warples of Wimbledon. So, I don't know. It was originally in what was called, Champion Terrace. It was originally called. So whether Champion Terrace, but I'm confused by that. But it apparently was in Wandsworth. And
Where the Southfield Shopping Centre is, that right?
yeah, I don't know. I can't work it out. There's no Warple Way in Wandsworth at the moment. Anyway, but it's in the Young's booklet as Warple Way. It's in Dorian's book as Warple Way. So I don't know. That is a mystery. Now the Bull, again, one of the older pubs in Wandsworth, recorded from actually 1617 onwards, and recorded a couple of times as the Black Bull in the 18th century, but licensed as the Bull in 1786. There's the watercolour by a man called Wilson. There it is. I suspect that photograph, just by the Wandle Bridge, I suspect that photograph was taken at more or less the same time as the following photograph, where it was all decorated up for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, 1887, and was rebuilt in 1910, but then bombed in 1940, sadly, and never rebuilt. So there's a photograph of the interior with the landlord, or what is believed to be the landlord, Mr. East. And I took that photograph the other week. It's not very effective, but showing more or less as it is. The sun was against me, unfortunately. But it would have been pretty much where Betfred are now. The Railway Tavern, a bit further up and on the opposite side, a bit nearer the High Street, and on the other side from the Grapes. Licensed 1849 and had a musical license from 1861 to 1885, and it had a first floor hall which held up to 100 people. Sold by Young's in 1938 and probably demolished soon afterwards. The Red Lion in Ram Street, which was originally, as I mentioned, called Red Lion Street. According to Dorian, I haven't investigated this, but up to about 10 years ago, some brown glazed tiles from the ground floor survived on the wall of the Ram Brewery. But I haven't investigated that.
I'm just slightly worried about time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just flick through these because this is the last one. This is the last one, Jenny. So the bell near the river there. This was an old photograph dug out by the Heritage Service showing the bell and the crane on the right-hand side there, with the town, with the pound, the animal pound, in the centre there, fenced off, and that watercolour, they unearthed also anonymous watercolour, probably taken from the photograph. And that, I think, is it. Yes. 9 o'clock. We got there.
Well, that was a really interesting whip through places that you vaguely remembered and didn't remember and have to go and look at buildings of and so on. So thank you very much. You could tell from everybody sitting here quietly and engaging with you how interesting everybody found it. So thank you very much, Phil.
You're welcome.
Does anybody want to ask any quick questions?
I won't be able to answer them, but I'll do my best.
How many pubs do you think were built on the arrival of trains in Wandsworth?
On the arrival of trains.
Yes, the arrival of the train in Wandsworth. How many pubs were built by the station?
Yeah.
You've got the Falcon, by how many do you think were built?
You got the Falcon by Clapham Junction Station, haven't you?
Yeah.
Although I suppose that's technically Battersea, but well, at least I didn't include the Falcon because it's technically Battersea.
And they're very beautiful.
But I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that, for example, Putney had the railway hotel, which was built in 1857. The railway arrived in Putney in 1846. The railway hotel was opened in 1857, so 10 years after the railway arrived in Putney, which is probably a typical delay. But I honestly don't.
How many altogether?
I can't say for Wandsworth.
Well, the Alma is...
The Alma, of course, is right opposite Wandsworth Town Station, so I'm not aware of the Alma as having been a railway hotel, so to speak, but it may well have been.
Well, the standard would have been, because it's the way it was built. Standard was certainly...
Yeah?
Well, you've got the hope about Wandsworth.
We can't talk about every pub. Quick questions.
I just wondered if you could give any suggestion why pubs are so often built on corners. Do they have separate doors for saloon and pub?
No, that's
Wherever you're coming from, you can spot one.
it's a good question, but yeah, it's true. I mean, you can obviously see them from two different roads, but you're absolutely right.
Deliveries, easy to deliver.
Deliveries, yeah. Oh, good point. I'm going to check how many pubs in Wandsworth are on corners. I suspect probably the majority.
More research.
Yeah.
Brenda at the back there.
No, I think on the corners partly because there used to be a room for ladies only because they couldn't possibly go into the real pub. So you often had a room for ladies only. And that retained in Scotland very long, for quite a long time.
Oh,
I can assure you.
right.
I wanted a little plug for the Spread Eagle pub on the corner of Garrett Lane. And I was in there a couple of weeks ago, and we were shown the pretty chased glass in the Alma pub. Well, the Spread Eagle has the most beautiful chased glass.
Yes.
It's very lovely inside. You know, if you've got time, pop in and have a look. It's very interesting inside.
I didn't mention that,
It's
but
got
yeah,
food.
still got, yeah, I think Victorian, yeah. Yeah.
I think one of the reasons the pubs are often built on corners is because the origins of them, a lot of pubs are derived from the local aristocrat who tended to give his retiring servant or helper a tiny corner of his estate in which to have a pub.
Oh, right.
By building it on the corner, it didn't take up much land.
No, good point. Good point. It's never occurred to me before to think about pubs on corners, but you know, when you think about it, yeah, most of them are on corners. The Builders Arms, you know, was an exception, built in a row of houses. But
Last one. Last one.
yeah,
Come on.
yeah, yeah.
Come on, Will.
Good point.
Tell him.
Very quickly.
This isn't a question, but as a point of interest, there's a house in the Boltons where there's a blue plaque saying that Jenny Lind lived there as well. So she got about a bit.
And isn't it interesting how many pubs revert to the first name?
Oh, no, very rarely, I would say. I've never understood why pubs change their name. I mean, we had several there. I mentioned one in Putney that started life as the Horseshoe, then was a Sportsman, Rat and Parrot, Slug and Lettuce. Incidentally, the East Hill was a Slug and Lettuce briefly. But yeah, Slug and Lettuce, then it became Citizen Smith, then Lost and Co., then Lost Society, and now it's closed. And I think, why bother? You know, why change the name? Similarly, the Fox and Hounds in Putney, that some of you may know, has had 7 names.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for a continuingly interesting talk. So well done, and we see you all at the party. and in January and in February. So look forward to that, when wine will be imbibed, if not beer.
All the talks that we've had are actually on our website. So if anybody has missed any or wants to rehear some, I've got details here of how you can get on to them. You can also go through onto the Society website.
Except that one, unfortunately, there was a breakdown in technology tonight, and that is not recorded. I hope.